Um, well, let's get rolling a little bit. So thank you guys for tuning in and joining today for Concert Business Basics. I have Sean O'Connell from Live Nation in Colorado as my guest today. We're going to talk about show expenses. But first, Sean, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up here?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Uh, I'm Sean. I'm the VP of Operations for Live Nation in Colorado, and what that means is that I do pretty much whatever needs to get done. Um, I've been the general manager of a couple of venues. I've kind of overseen our business operation for the last few years in general for our market, and just kind of take over things as needed. A little production, a little accounting, a little bit of sales stuff, and a whole lot of oversight. So a pretty varied background. I'm from Chicago originally and moved out to Colorado in about 2001 and have worked in sports and entertainment for longer than I care to say, going back to the original Comiskey Park, and spent a year at the old Chicago Stadium before they tore it down, and moved over to the United Center, where I worked in the venue ticket operations and for the Blackhawks for a while. Spent some time in a large theater, spent some time in sports, working in stadiums, arenas, everything else. And for about the last, I don't know, 15 plus years have really concentrated more on the concert side of the world. And as I said, oversaw a couple of venues, one large amphitheater called Fiddler's Green for about 7 years, the Fillmore Auditorium, which is a 3,600 capacity, mostly GA venue here in downtown Denver for about 12 years. And, and after that, and in addition to that, a lot of show settlements, a lot of working with our other venue partners. I'm generally at Red Rocks about 40 times a year, not this year, obviously. Pepsi Center Arena, we do a lot of shows at. So I think last year it was close to 50 arena shows that Live Nation produced here locally at the Pepsi Center. So I work pretty closely with those venues as well on everything from their security and guest services to show settlements and finances, and just how we can be doing things in a way that Live Nation is going to be proud of and the venues are going to be proud of.
So you are obviously at home. How's your quarantine going? Is work busy? Is it slow? Is it chaotic? Like, don't have to give us the details, but just generally.
No, I mean, we've got plenty to do. At first, it was a whole lot of trying to get things moved around as far as dates, and in anticipation of opening back up. Now it's really kind of pushing things a little bit farther down the road, but staying in touch with our clients, working with those venues on what we might be able to do to open up a little bit more quickly, from downsizing to, potentially things like drive-in concerts, to festival site, kind of day-long festival type sites, and how we can make those operate. So I've been in touch with city government, state government, as well as some committees and groups of people that are within the industry to make sure that we're all kind of agreeing on what those best practices will be to open up as quickly and safely as we can. So keep them busy on that. And our staff size is temporarily a little bit smaller than it used to be. So just kind of taking over for some other folks in their roles as well. So keeping as busy as I can, and trying to keep sane while I'm hanging out at home.
Yeah, I don't envy your position of trying to keep a business afloat in an unknown pandemic situation that severely affects live events.
I think Live Nation has been really good about, trying to do their best to take care of staff, with the understanding that there might not be any money coming in for, months. But we're pretty well positioned company for a big company as big as we are. And I think everybody on this call probably knows it's the biggest concert producer and promoter in the world. They do really pay attention to the people, which helps.
That was great. Well, I know everybody's certainly looking to Live Nation as kind of a guide on best practices and knowing that you guys are really careful about how you do things and you're only going to do things that make the best sense for all the patrons that attend. So I know that as a company, the industry kind of looks to you as kind of what's Live Nation doing. We can kind of take our that as a guide on what to do. So thanks for all you are doing on that front.
Hey.
Have you taken up any quarantine hobbies?
Other than drinking,
Wasn't that a hobby before though?
that I mean, isn't it always? Nothing new. I'm trying to knock a few kind of household things off the list, and the dog's getting walked more than he used to. But other than that, not a whole lot. I'm chomping at the bits to get back to work. It's odd to be home at night every day instead of, you know, being at a show until midnight or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
You at least nights a week. So it's a little bit different.
Well, let's pretend like we are at a show, settling that show, shall we?
I like it.
All right, so what I want to do is we're going to pretend like these are pre-COVID times. It's like a normal settlement before the world got all weird. And so you're the promoter rep. I'm the tour accountant. So these are our normal roles that we kind of normally have a little bit. And a lot of that at settlement is you bring me pieces of paper and then you explain to me what they are.
Sure. And
so we don't have the actual pieces of paper for you to hand me, but I have a list of the categories that those things would generally fall into. So the first thing on our list is advertising. And the very first show that I settled professionally when I was at Talent Buyer Jam Productions, I was in your position, and the person sitting over here, his name was Matt, and later hired me to do the Warped Tour. And I handed him an ad pack, which had been handed to me. I hadn't looked through it. It looked very professionally put together. And the first thing he said to me, this is the first thing on my first date, my first settlement, he said, well, let me get out my ruler. And I was like, oh my God, what for what? And he said, well, I'm going to measure the newspaper ads and make sure that they are the size that you're saying that they are in the bill. And I was like, are you seriously going to do? I'm thinking, are you seriously going to do that? And what if they're not? Like, I'm sure they are, but so can you explain, like, what's an ad pack? What's usually in it? And what kind of questions do tour accountants ask you about it?
Sure. Ad packs are pretty comprehensive records of all that we spent money on to market the show. And that's from radio to, you know, print, and believe it or not, those things still exist. Radio ads, print ads, you know, local weeklies, you know, the big dailies, the big magazine in town get a fair amount of that money, but the majority now is going to be online ads. What was spent with Facebook, what was spent with Google, it's all a lot more targeted. But there still is, I mean, everybody out there sees the occasional TV ad for a concert. They see a billboard, they see things like that. So it's a detailed record of what was done to market the show and what those things cost. And going back to the point of, you know, is it a quarter page ad that's 3 by 3 inches, or if it's an eighth a page ad that's supposed to be 2 by 2 inches, and somebody wanted to pull out a ruler. I don't think I've seen that move in about 10 years, because I would probably just close up the book and walk out and say, we're not doing this.
It was a long time ago that happened.
Oh yeah, it's certainly, I've seen it, but generally there's that full pack that has real examples of those newspaper ads and magazines and flyers and things like that, as well as billing from any of those media outlets that you're working with, which basically has a spreadsheet as a header that breaks down what all those expenses are. Within our internal settlement, we'll usually break it down to those few categories. So what's our total that was spent on TV, on internet, on producing those ads, posters, things like that. radio, et cetera. And it's going to have that full breakdown as well as the total spend. And all of that comes from an initial budget that's agreed upon. And this goes for basically everything in our settlement. There's an initial budget that was agreed upon at the deal that was made between the buyer and the agent on what we expect to spend on everything. And in something like advertising, it should be pretty close to that. It can be way under. If a show sells out in a day and we had a marketing plan that was going to be a month long with radio ads and everything else, it can be a lot less. If it's over, it better have been with the agreement of the band, because in a lot of cases, the band's going to be the ones paying the majority of that total.
Yeah, so as the tour accountant these days, I want to know that the marketing people on both sides, before the show happens, have agreed on all of those details. So the budget was created, the promoter and a lot of times the artist or the tour is also going to do some advertising. So it's a much more collaborative venture. There's going to be bills that are showing up on both sides. And I usually try to make sure that the marketing people that know what is going on have talked to each other and agreed with each other that those expenses are okay. And if that's not kind of the situation, if that's not exactly possible, then the things that I'm looking for on the day of the show, when I'm handed this, if I have to evaluate, does this look reasonable? I basically go through the cover sheet and I see, is there some sort of documentation or backup for the things that are on the cover sheet? But these days, I'd say mostly everybody's agreed in advance on the exact marketing costs. And they're the best to verify the accuracy of those. So that's kind of advertising. Do you do much budgeting for shows, or do you just get the information, like the budget, after the fact?
No, I work pretty hand in hand with our buyers and our production folks on exactly what we expect expenses to be. I've usually got a pretty good idea of what, a 4-truck show, what we're going to need in stagehands, for example, and if there are oddballs that I see on a tour rider that may cause things to be more or less expensive, we'll try to get that noted as soon as it comes in. So yeah, I work pretty hand in hand with those folks on making sure that we know what to expect.
So on the advertising budget, it can really range. And a lot of times that's where, who's ever involved in the marketing of the show is going to kind of chime in advance and say, we really need X amount of money to properly market the show. And they're looking at things like, how much radio do we think we're going to do? How much digital, how much print, and then how many people are we trying to sell tickets to? How many tickets do these need to resell? It's not really a good formula for coming up with an ad budget.
No, but there's a lot of experience in both sides, right? I mean, the artists and their groups have an idea of, they know what size venues they're playing. They know what kind of crowd they should be drawing, probably, if all things are equal to, the same thing that they did last time or another similar artist. Same for us. I mean, if we're doing a similar show at the Fillmore that has a 3,600 capacity, that we know we can only sell that many tickets. We know what we've had to spend in the past to be able to reach those people. We've got a pretty good idea, and that goes all the way up to stadium shows. In addition to that, working with somebody like Live Nation, we have touring departments that work very extensively with the artists as well, and a lot of those spends are going to be worked out between our touring folks that are marketing an entire tour, 46 shows or whatever it might be, and the artist camp as well. So I mean, it is in some ways a guess, but it's a super educated guess.
Yeah. So I had a question come in that if there's a general a breakdown percentage of how much to spend on marketing out of the total budget, how much to spend on production. And so that's where I was kind of going with that question. There's not really a percentage thing, but there's historical data and very educated guesses on what it takes to make the show happen in each of these line items. So
absolutely.
Let's see. Our next one, Box office expense. So if you're handing me a box office expenses, what's usually kind of encompassed in that?
I mean, it's basically a labor bill. It's as far as that goes, and a lot of these will be a labor bill. So did we have an appropriate number of people working the box office to be able to accommodate day of show sales, will call, distribution, et cetera? Is it a reasonable per person cost? You know, are we all working in good faith toward getting the show done the right way for the right cost? So that's basically a straight labor bill. We usually see a listing of who it is that's working, what they're getting paid per hour, and you know, a full breakdown of labor in that particular area.
Yep, agreed. Every once in a while, I'll see a flat fee where it's like, it costs X amount of money for us to open the box office for a show day. But usually those are venues that don't have a lot of variance in the number of people that they are having on site on each day. Okay, catering. So catering budgets, I know from my time as a talent buyer, we usually, based on the size of the venue, could estimate about what the catering budget would be for a show. What are some of the things on your end that kind of go into on the day of you're handing over paperwork wise to people?
Sure. I mean, as far as those bills go, and you're right, it's somewhat on the size of the venue. It's somewhat on the size of the tour. Obviously, a tour that's got 20 buses full of people and you know, 18 trucks is going to take a whole lot more catering than a smaller event. But it's it again, and a lot of these things, we have to do a good job of making sure that we agree in advance as to what is going to be provided on show day. The initial budgets might be made when the deal is made a year out from the show itself, and they might just put in a number that says, hey, we're going to cater this tour for $10,000 per day. And when they come in, it's a lot larger tour than what was anticipated, and it ends up being $15,000. Not that big of a deal as long as that conversation is had in advance. But what I'm going to be turning over to you is basically a bill from our local caterer, who usually is one company that is doing that service for any given venue all the time. We have a pretty good idea of what our expenses should be per person, per meal, what our labor expense should be on there. Additional things would be things like dressing room, rider catering. So additional bills for something that we might send a runner out to go provide and put into a dressing room. Alcohol that might be coming from the venue could be a separate thing. And we're all particular about liquor licenses and how those work and how we make sure that we're compliant. So it might be a series of 3 or 4 different bills that are coming in to make up that full number.
So for us on Warped Tour, ice was always part of our catering bill because we would get an entire truck full of ice every day. And because people consume that, I filed that under catering.
Yep. Donuts.
Yes.
Your donuts every day too.
So we carried a caterer with us on tour that would they would order from Cisco all the food stuff that they would need. They would have their own runner and pay directly for the runner to go out, and we'll talk about what a runner is when we get to that, but a person that runs errands to go out and buy their local shopping. So none of that was coming through the promoter. The things that we needed directly from the promoter was a giant truck full of ice and donuts in the morning, because those needed to be fresh for our stagehands and our crew, and that's not something that you can order like a couple of days in advance. So, and on Warped Tour, I mean, we had breakfast, lunch, dinner. We did not, a lot of times tours will then have an after show food also where there's kind of a 4th meal because everybody's kind of on a different eating schedule. We didn't really have any dressing rooms or that kind of hospitality. All of the bands, this is how fancy we got on Warped Tour. They all got 1 case of beer and 1 case of water. that was their hospitality writer, whether they liked it or not. And they would come to the production office and somebody would have to check off the sheet that, yes, they picked up their water. Nobody else can come claim that water. So different tours have, obviously that was Warped Tour's a unique situation in most cases for coming through.
Everybody has heard about the bag of M&Ms without the brown ones in it, things like that that are on the catering riders. Those actually happen. They are more to make sure that people like me are reading that rider, and it's also kind of a list of things so that if we know that our budget was $10,000 and our straight catering was going to be $10,000, we've got to go back and say, hey, all that stuff that you want for your dressing room, what do you really need? What do you not really need? Because we don't want to spend the extra money on that third bottle of wine that more often than not is left behind or taken on the bus anyway. So that we can have that conversation again, hopefully in advance of the show.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that all of these show expenses, if the show is doing really well and we're in the back end where there's money left to share and the artist is getting 90% of the money left to share and the promoter is getting 10% of it, a promoter is going to be much more willing to be like, yes, I would love to get you guys steaks for dinner and a case of wine and a black carpet in your dressing room and whatever you want, because the artist is really paying 90% of it. If the show's not doing well, then the promoter is paying that full cost. And that's where you're really going to see, hey, can we really kind of only get what we need today?
We're on a very, believe it or not, we're on a very low margin business too, so it does make a difference. There's not a lot of money to be made directly by ticket sales versus expenses on any given show or any given promoter, which is why you see big boys like Live Nation, AEG, what have you, out there doing so many of the big shows, is that it's a very risky proposition. So it's important for us to really pay attention to every last dime if it's our money, and Jen, in your case, same thing if it's the tour's money. Is it worth it to have steak that day and get paid $1,000 less than you would have?
Yeah, and I think it's important for bands to understand, especially when they're starting out, if they're putting things on their hospitality rider, they're ultimately paying for it in some way. So it's not just Santa is not bringing these things. It's the band is actually paying for it themselves, even if that doesn't look obvious on the day of.
Sure.
So moving on to our next item, equipment rental. If I'm doing kind of an arena tour or a theater tour, my line item would probably just be equipment rental, and anything that falls into that category would be in there. But for Warped Tour, on my sheet, I broke out forklifts, power, golf carts, barricade, fencing, tents. So pretty much, as the tour accountant, I'm going to look at the accuracy of the bills that you gave me.
Mm-hmm.
Things that I'm going to look for are on tents, for instance. You, Live Nation, are selling beer and making lots of money off of that beer. Me, as the representative for the tour does not get any of that beer money. So I do not want to be paying for your beer tents.
Yep. Yeah,
also,
makes sense.
If you rented forklifts and you've got our show today, but you've got a show yesterday that also needed those forklifts, we got to split that cost.
Yep. Totally
So those
agree.
are the things
Yep, and on my end, it's just making sure, and again, this is across the board, if there are things that we are spending money on that are pertaining to the production of the show itself, I have to make sure that those are all being included as show costs. So if I have to furnish some dressing rooms and rent some couches, or if somebody demands that they have to have, white leather furniture, I better make sure that I've got that bill in there, and that it's all going into the show as a cost. And even if I do rent a forklift for the week for several different shows, yeah, we do want to make sure that we're laying that off properly on all of these things. And I think, one of the reasons I think that Jen had me on today is because I understand, and she does too, and we've settled shows together several times. is that it's not a contest to see who can take most. It's a collaborative effort to make sure that we're producing the right show the right way, with the expenses being allocated correctly. And, you know, I mean, there certainly have been some times that I've been on show settlements with somebody who wanted to get the best, you know, whatever I can do to get that extra $500 out of Live Nation. Well, the deal's already made. We don't need to, you know, renegotiate the deal so that you make an extra couple $100 and I have to pay for that forklift that was already budgeted or discussed in advance. I think that making sure that you're doing it with a sense of what's right and what's fair and what's realistic for what was needed for the show is probably the most important takeaway.
Yeah, I think a phrase that we use a lot is, was that in the spirit of the deal? Like, we're not going to renegotiate the deal, but what was the intention when this deal was negotiated? And I know you, one of the things I appreciate is we were both sticklers for accuracy. And like you said, it's not, and I think sometimes it feels like I want to win this debate, but really I want it to be an accurate, good, fun debate, and we all agree at the end that yes, this is the most accurate way that things should be allocated. Yeah, for sure. So next up, medical. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of medical is typically on site for a show, and like what kind of what are you seeing there?
Sure. Again, it depends on what the show is, but for most larger events, we're going to have an ambulance and some EMTs on site. And that is to make sure that we can accommodate anything that happens in the crowd, that makes sure that anything that happens backstage, anything that happens as stagehands are putting up or tearing down stages and so forth. So that's the biggest thing. It's usually either a separate billing from a municipality that has an ambulance service, or in our case, usually it's a private company that has that service, that has licensed EMTs that are going to be on site. Something like Warped Tour is going to be a lot bigger than something that's, you know, a seated show that's going to be more likely to be folks that are my age going to it, that aren't going to be diving off stages and hurting themselves and, you know, breaking ankles and getting heat stroke throughout the day. But that's the big one. Occasionally there are a few other things. We here in Denver will have oxygen at a lot of our shows. That'll be a bill that will go in, and that's generally a backstage expense as opposed to a front of house. But, you know, things like that are generally what goes into the medical billing.
So are you telling me that you're not typically crowd surfing and moshing these days?
These days? Not so much.
You're not participating in any walls of death where the crowd separates and then runs at each other?
Talk about how many pairs of glasses I lost 25 years ago in those kind of crowds? Yeah. Different beast.
Okay, permits. So this can really vary. I just usually have one permit line, but it can mean a lot of different things. It can be parking permits for tour buses in downtown Chicago where we have to block off streets, spots on the street. It can be sound permits if we're having an outdoor show and there's residential areas nearby. What kind of permits do you
Sure, and
every once in a while?
For something like Warped Tour, again, it may be tent permits. It's going to be permits for generators being used in our area. Again, street permits if we're having to block a street, parking, things like that. Yeah, and occasionally it's even more. Do we have a special events permit depending on what the space is that we're using? So it can be a lot of things, but again, it's just a matter of making sure that we're taking care of all of them. You certainly don't want to not pull a permit that you need either. It's a good way to stop a show without it happening.
Permits are an area where generally it is better to ask permission rather than have to ask forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Similar-ish, police. I found there was a significant increase at some point in the amount that the local police would decide how many people they were sending to the event for various reasons, and then they basically tell you how much they're going to charge you.
Yeah, and this is one of my roles in some of our outside venues too, is making sure that we're having a conversation with the venue and the police about what's an appropriate number and what their actual role should be. And police don't love being told what their role should be, but in reality, they are working for us. They're being paid separately for their time there. We need them there. We want them there. We do want to make sure that we're collaborating on what exactly those needs are. And generally for us, that means we like to make sure that there's a presence at the entries so that people that are maybe a little bit worried about being out there in a crowd have that fear alleviated a little bit, and somebody that might be a knucklehead when they're going in might think twice about what they're going to do. Additionally, for how we react to somebody who needs to be taken care of in a way that our local security just can't necessarily handle, having them on site. Additionally to that, we'll generally have a couple of people from the fire department on most shows. Outdoor is a little bit different, but when there are generators, when there are pyro, when there are things like that, we'll generally have somebody from the local fire department there. And nowadays in larger venues at very least, and in smaller venues, sometimes depending on the show, we'll also have dogs there sniffing out for potential bombs or weapons. They'll do a full sweep of the backstage and the entire venue, as well as be present at the gates for pretty much any big show. So all of those expenses will get wrapped into that.
I know at least at one arena here in Chicago, probably both of them big ones, the traffic after the show, there's usually police on that is helping direct the traffic, because you've got 20,000 people that are at an event that is going to kind of like screw up the traffic flow if they are left to their own devices. Yep. And so for the surrounding community and the flow of the community that the show is happening in, having some traffic direction usually helps after the show. Runners and vans. So can you explain a little bit what that is? And
sure. Yeah, for almost any show, and Jen, you alluded to it a little bit, we have some folks who are working as runners, and that's exactly what it sounds like. They will do errands. They may go pick up a crew from an airport to bring them to the to the site. They may be going shopping for some dressing room catering type things that one of the bands needs. They may be going to pick up guitar strings, sweat socks, whatever it might be over the course of the day. But depending on the size of the show, the type of band, it can be anywhere from 1 to 3, 4, 5 people that are serving that role. Generally, at least half of those will be in a 15-passenger type van, which will enable them to take a lot more people, equipment, and what have you to and from wherever they've got to take it. For Red Rocks, we always, for example, have another additional runner and van, because the way the backstage is, you can't necessarily walk up this steep hill to get from where the parking area is, where the buses are, up to backstage. So we have a runner and van that basically just goes back and forth from parking lot to stage all day, all night, from when the crew arrives till when they leave.
Yeah, and as a touring person, I think something that the outside world doesn't fully realize is when we're on site, like, we are at our desks, we are not able to go run our own errands. Like, also, we're not familiar with the local area. Sometimes you're not near any stuff. We arrived, I woke up in your parking lot on a tour bus, and I'm gonna go to my office. I'm gonna maybe like be in the venue, but like I'm not leaving the venue site because I need to be on site. So having people that are familiar with the local area, that are good at finding the laundromat that's going to be open on Sundays, and knowing where to track down, like where's the local guitar center, like those types of things. being familiar with the local area is something that is essential for those of us that are not from the area or able to leave the site to go do those things.
As far as billing on that, again, I mean, the number of runners that are necessary is, again, that's always discussed in advance. Usually these are production advances. There's a budget for it to begin with that we may agree to change that from 2 runners and vans to 3 or 4, depending on what the tour needs might be. So it's again, it's just one of those things that we got to make sure that we're talking about ahead of time. Vans, you know, for us, our numbers, when we rent a van, we get billed after the fact based on mileage and things like that. So personally, I will put in a flat number for our vans to make sure that it's covering everything from our insurance and mileage and everything else to be expected on top of what our base rate is. Sometimes you'll see that. Sometimes you'll see just a flat bill from Enterprise or Hertz or whoever. But you know, just different ways of doing it.
Yeah, and I'm going to have a workshop coming up on riders, so I will address this again in that. But as the tour accountant, I'm going to take the rider that is information that the local production needs from the tour to put on the artistic vision of the show, and it includes things like how many runners are needed, how many vans. So I'm going to take that rider as the tour accountant, and that's going to be my starting point, in addition to the budget that I've gotten from the agent, to go, is this number reasonable? And so if you tell me that I've got 4 runners that we requested in the rider, and then you show me a bill for 6 runners, that's where I'm going to start having questions, because I know it's not what the tour asked for. So then I'll go to the production manager for the tour and say, we had 6 runners today. And he'll say, oh yeah, that's right, I forgot, there was a weird thing and we had 2 extra runners today. And I'll say, all right, great. So that's kind of the process on my end to determine if what you're handing me makes sense with what we ordered, what was agreed upon, and what was part of the budget. Security. So security can really vary quite a bit, I would think, from show to show. I mean, depending on what the audience is like. But so I'm getting a security bill from you that is how many people were working, what hours were they working, and what was their rate. What kind of variances do you see from different tours coming through?
Yeah, you know, and security means a few different things depending on how we're allocating it. It can be straight security, those folks that are wandering around, roaming, trying to make sure that everything's going the way that it should. It can be those folks, and one of the big variances for a show like, you know, again, Warped Tour, as opposed to something that's more of a seated theater show, is how many people do you need in the barricade to keep the stage safe? It can be 1 every 5 feet. If you're in a real high activity show, it can be 1 on each end of the stage if it's a lower activity show. So that's a lot of bodies, and that adds up to a lot of money over the course of a show. I mean, it's a fairly big percentage of what our overall you know, operational budget is. So that size of crowd is going to determine how many people we need doing security checks at the gates, and ushers and ticket takers and things like that. So all of those are included in that general heading as well. So what's the activity level and size of the crowd are going to be the biggest indicators for our real security, and the setup and when and how we think people will be coming and going from the show on kind of the gate staff. I would say that most places are a little bit more careful than they used to be to make sure that we're covering all potential areas of ingress and egress, and that you know, as it is way more important now than it might have been 15 years ago, that everybody walking into the show is properly searched coming in. It's also more important that, you know, that we're really buttoning up every door, and nobody's able to push open a door in an alley so somebody can come in. We don't know what that person's doing, what that person's bringing. So those numbers really do vary show to show. One other thing, Jen, that in addition to regular security, you'll see on Live Nation bills across the country now a line item for global security, which may not have been there the last time that you did Warped Tour, but we have a department of our company now that is completely dedicated to higher level security. So they're keeping track of things on the dark web, things that are being tossed around on social media for potential threats. It's people who were FBI, high-level FBI type folks that are working in that division. And in order for us to have that, we allocate, and we do have this as an agreement with agents, and it goes in as a show cost right from the start. We've got a certain dollar amount that we allocate based on the size of the venue to every show across the board to make sure that we can have that service available to us. And that happens for every Live Nation event.
That's amazing. That was not happening the last time I settled the Warped Tour with you, and that's great to hear that there's a higher level of attention being paid to how to create a safe space for the patrons, with things that as normal consumers we sit here and go like, oh, how would you be able to predict that? It's nice to know that there are some highly experienced professionals that are taking care of that. Yep. Sound and lights. So most of the time you're going to have some production reimbursement where the tour is bringing sound and lights with them. If they're not, sometimes there's a local rental. Either way, it's a show cost. So either you're paying the local sound and light company to bring in the equipment, or it exists in the venue and you're paying the venue kind of rents it on a monthly basis or whatever, or you're reimbursing the tour from that. Yep, that's it.
Pretty cut and dried. We've got to have audio, we've got to have, we got to have lights, and the only time that it's a little bit different, and I'll use the Fillmore Auditorium as an example. We do have a monthly rental of our PA, our basic desks, and our lighting rig. In addition to that, there might be a request for a number of different lights that are, if a band, and the Fillmore is kind of an in-between size, so not everybody's carrying full audio and lighting and everything else. They may have a request for some additional ground lighting. They may ask for a different kind of soundboard, things like that would be extra cost. You'll see those. And again, those are all things that should be worked out in advance, and that's why we're seeing those bills.
Okay, so stagehands, again, a labor bill, and precisely like as the tour accountant, the first thing I'm going to do with the stagehand bill is hand it directly to the production manager and say, can you tell me if this is what you asked for?
Yep, it is not at all unusual for that bill to go to the production manager, to have them sign it, and I will take that signed copy and bring it to Jen or whoever her counterpart might be at any given show, just to make sure that things were done the way that they were requested, that we had the staffing that we were supposed to have. And they might go even a step farther and check a sign-in list from the stagehands that day. They might be doing a click count as folks are coming in, if it's a bigger tour with a larger number, just to make sure that the number that was requested is actually there, and that's what they're paying for.
And the stagehand bill is going to encompass, when I say stagehands, loaders, which might be two separate sets of people, forklift drivers, riggers, electricians. That's
in stadium shows, it'll include the stage build, the steel, as well. So some of the bigger ones.
Oh, and I should mention actually, like stagehands. So when I'm not going to talk about that now. Sorry, scratch that thought that I didn't get all the way out. Telephone and internet. So this, I don't know how much this is still a thing, but back before the internet was a thing, and back before cell phones were a thing, anytime we worked at a show, the production office needed telephone lines, and long distance, and this sounds so foreign to talk about, but like long distance got charged per minute on how many minutes you talked. And if you were calling international, it was a higher per minute cost. So the origin of this was you don't get the actual phone bill with the phone records until a month or so later after the show. You've got to assume that everybody on that tour is foreign and calling their family or whatever all day long, and they're going to rack up $200 a day per phone line in phone charges.
Yeah, and you know, the reality is it's probably pretty outdated. There are some venues who do get charged on internet connections as they're being used. So if we do have Ethernet lines getting plugged in so that people can have their own wireless system in there, it might cost a little bit more. It's a line item that's still there most of the time. It's usually not a big number, and it's just a way to make sure that the venue's expenses are covered for their utilities.
So it's one of those areas that as a tour accountant, I sort of see as sometimes an acceptable profit center where I understand that it may not be a real hard actual cost. And depending on how the show's doing, I may ask more questions about it than not. And I feel like half the time it can easily go away. And a lot of times they say, you know what, this is the real thing that I'm really getting charged, so we have to keep it in. So that's telephone and internet. Towels. Funny local story about towels. So my husband was in a band in Chicago called Brother Lowdown that, I mean, at their peak had maybe 40 to 50 people attend the show. Stayed very much within the Chicago city limits. I think they went on a couple of one week-long tour. That was more
to Peoria.
No, they got wild and went towards the East Coast. So they were a hobby band, frankly, not like a serious band. But on their very final show, the venue asked, "How many towels do you want?" And he said, "We've never been asked that before. Why are you asking? We're not showering there. We live here. Why do we need towels?" And I said, "Because you get sweaty on stage, and people that are touring through need towels to actually shower with." So I always think I think about that. It's a little funny that we have all of these security and stagehands, these big show expenses, and then there's always towels.
And towels are, for people who work in the venues, it's a real thing. And it is, we joked about the donuts on Warped Tour, but if you don't have towels, it's a problem. People do need to shower. People do need to wipe their face on stage. People do need these things, and they're not free. So, for the venues and for the promoters, we have to buy those towels, clean those towels, replace those towels when they inevitably end up on the bus. And there's a real expense to them. So, generally it ends up being a few bucks a towel that is charged, and that can add up. If you're on a big tour with, 100 people on the crew, that's a real number. So it's, when we get past $100 or so, it's going to have an effect on the overall net revenues for one or the other or both of us, no matter what the size of the show. So it's,
as a touring person, I just have to put a little plug out there. I will tell you, we love the venues that have decent towels.
mm-hmm.
Nothing's worse than, we call them car wash towels, because that's what they are. You can see through them. They're the thickness of paper. They feel like paper. They're this size. They don't even wrap around you. And I'm not that big of a person, but I'll be seriously, it's like a hand towel. Those days are kind of shitty when it comes to all right, now I'm going to go take a shower in a locker room with a shitty towel, compared to nice fluffy towels. So we love the venues that have the nice fluffy comfy towels. It's a little feeling of home that seems like it shouldn't be a big deal, but it's those little things for those of us on the road that are. So venue package and venue rental. Sometimes venues throw in kind of all these things. They own a forklift and they own this and they own that. So they just say, all right, all the stuff that we have, here's the amount. We're not going to itemize the things. And that'll frequently be called a venue package. And venue rental is typically like the venue's profit.
Yep.
Right?
What it costs for them to operate and have a profit. Sometimes that venue package might include things like electrical shore power. Again, utilities actually do have a cost when you do have buses plugged into them all day. Maybe in an arena, it's a conversion staff that has to be employed to set up a stage differently that the venue has than what somebody might have normally had. So there are a few things in there that might get allocated to that venue package. And then again, rent is rent, and it's something that's agreed to as to what that should be. And if that number doesn't match up to what our offer said it should be, that's generally going to be on us.
So that kind of covers our fixed expenses, where it doesn't matter how many tickets we've sold or how many people are showing up or what the revenue was. Those costs, they are what they are. Now, they're fixed in the sense that the bill is what it is. It doesn't mean the bill can't be affected, like in the case of stagehands, of how many people in advance we can adjust what it might be, but it does not vary based on attendance or revenue. So moving on to our variable expenses, credit card and ticket charges. So can you explain credit card charges to us?
Sure. Credit card charges are just what they sound like. If you have a transaction for $100 and you're paying with a credit card, usually there is call it 3% charge that the credit card company will charge the vendor, right? So we don't want to be the ones paying it. The venue doesn't want to be the ones paying it. So we'll either add it to the cost of the ticket, or it will be charged as an expense to the show.
So if I go to a venue box office and I buy a $40 ticket, it is the same price whether I pay cash or if I pay with a credit card as the consumer. Yep. But on your end, if I pay with a credit card, you have to pay Visa 3% of that.
You got it.
Ticket charges. It used to be there was like 10 cents a ticket for the actual hard ticket stock. That's not really a thing anymore.
It's pretty rare now. I think that, if there's a credit card charge, that's usually about it. There are so few hard tickets actually allocated anymore anyway, and the expense of them isn't what it used to be. So if you see that, if I saw that, I would question it. And if it's on there, it's probably one of those things, and here's a secret I probably shouldn't tell. There are probably a couple of things like that are going to be minor charges that if there are issues between us, if there are any disagreements that why are our expenses over budget, I can point to something like that and say, that's something that we will take on in order to make that work.
And we always appreciate it when you do that.
You have a question there, Jen.
I do? I have like the Q&A and the chat, but they were covered up, so thank you. When credit card charges are a show expense, does that mean it's an expense against the WOP, or should that expense be deducted at a box office settlement? Why am I blanking on what WOP stand for? Walkout potential. Thank you.
Gotcha. Those are kids that actually went to school for this, Jen.
Okay, so the question is, are they does that mean it, I think is the question, where does it show up? Right.
It's usually not going to come out at the box office settlement. It will be a separate line item, as a credit card charge.
In however it shows up, it has the same effect on the bottom line. So yes, it is going to affect the walkout potential. Now, one thing to this gets into a little bit of the complicatedness of how tickets are built into a ticketing system. A lot of times we'll take that credit card charge and we'll put it on top of the ticket price. So when you are buying a $40 ticket online to a show, and then you see the convenience fee, the service fee, like whatever additional fees beyond $40, one of the things that's included in that, but not usually written out, is that credit card charge. So a lot of times what we're seeing in the show expenses are only the credit cards that came through the primary box office, where there were not those additional ticket company fees added on.
Absolutely.
I think that's the question being asked. General liability insurance. So tell us what that is.
So we're talking about our per ticket
Yeah,
general
your
liability.
55 cents or whatever.
Yeah, so we'll charge 55 cents, which then is paid to our insurance company for general liability, meaning it is just a basic coverage for the show to happen. It's in addition to that, there will be very specific insurance policies pulled for the show. This is just the general. We are covering ourselves as promoter and show for having this event in case of any kind of suit that comes through. Additionally, per our artist contract, we'll make sure that the artist is showing that they have X number of dollars of insurance for the show. The venue will say we'll have to show proof of insurance for X number of dollars. But this covers us on a per guest basis, just what it says, general liability as folks are coming in, and that's done on the number of attendees in the house, generally done based on the drop count on the number of people that are actually there, as opposed to on paid tickets.
So we'll use the drop count number, which is the number of people that have walked through the door, whether they've had a free or a paid ticket. And if we don't have that drop count number, we'll use the paid plus the comp number, because that is the total number of attendees that potentially would have come through.
Yep.
License fees, ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. Just explain generally what those are.
Generally, they are music licensing. So anytime somebody plays a song, the writers of those songs are due a fee, a chunk of change for having been so good as to have written those songs. So there are different organizations that represent different artists and different songs. And in order to streamline the process, we basically pay all of them. In addition to those, there is one more now that is generally thrown on there, which is GMR, Global Music Rights, which Irving Azoff was kind enough to start charging for a couple of years ago as well.
So we don't get involved on the live event side. We collect this fee, we send it to the licensing company, we being whoever, the promoter or the venue or whoever.
And we do it on a monthly basis.
And the licensing company then somehow distributes it to its people. And literally, I know nothing about that process and don't need to for this discussion. But what we do to collect that, for calculate the fee that we are going to remit, for ASCAP and BMI, it is a percentage of the gross ticket sales revenue. And CSAC is a per ticket sold cost.
Yep.
And I don't remember what GMR is.
GMR is also a net revenue. So net of taxes and fees.
So on those, there's some industry standards, but really your promoter is going to tell you what is their arrangement with the licensing company, what are the fees they're due, and they'll have some sort of documentation on how that number is going to be calculated. It's usually in the sense that we said it might depend on what the capacity of the venue is. For smaller venues, they might have a monthly license where it's more of a flat fee per show. I've seen more for like restaurants and bars and stuff.
Yeah, on our venues, it's all calculated on a, as you said, ASCAP, BMI, and GMR on a net box office revenue. on CSAC on a per person. It does vary based on the size of the venue, on ASCAP and BMI, or on BMI now, and GMR.
All right. Well, have I forgotten anything?
You know, I went through, I think in any place that you didn't have it noted, Jen, I added it and we talked about it as we went through. That's pretty much it on a fairly standard show.
Yeah.
I can, if you want to get really deep, we can get into something like what a stadium settlement might look like, and those tend to be a little bit deeper, where you get into a few more line items, but they're basically all those things that Jen just talked about, with a little bit more breakdown, because it might be multiple days in building a stage, and you know, a few other things that you need. We don't need to put a floor cover down in an arena that the arena doesn't already have. We do have to do that at a stadium at very large expense and a lot of labor. We do have to put a little bit more into putting chairs down on the floor, for example, and rent them, whereas an arena might have them in-house, and a GA room, it's not really an expense. A few other things that we see relatively often that are the kind of thing that maybe isn't pre-negotiated are things like sign language interpreters, which can be expensive, and that can be in large venues or small. In order to be compliant with ADA, we've got to make sure that we're providing those at our expense as a show. But you know, I think that pretty much covered the expense side of things. Obviously, the whole other side of things is also, you know, how we enter what the revenues are, but that's kind of a different beast, apparently, for a different day.
One other thing to kind of take note of is, especially if it's the first show on a tour, the tour is going to have some rehearsal costs that the promoter should not have to be responsible for, because it should not be detrimental to the promoter that it happens to be the first show. So a lot of times on a first show, we'll load in a day or two early, which means we're going to have additional stagehands. We might have additional days of rental of things. And a lot of times we'll then break those bills down and say, if it was a normal show, what would the expense be? And then anything that's above and beyond that will get charged back to the tour as a rehearsal cost.
Yep, we still would have had to load in the show,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but we wouldn't have had to have staff, stagehands, et cetera, there for the actual rehearsal time, and potentially security to watch over everything for those days and nights that the artists are in the building.
I just lost my train of thought on where we were going. Are there any questions? That's what it was. Any questions that have popped up? Throw it in the chat, or I don't know. Hold on. Let me.
One more line item that I don't see on here, Jen, is cleaning. And again, that sometimes is going to be included in the venue rent. Sometimes it's going to be a separate billing. Most of the time, you know, it's a separate line item when we are settling on specific line items.
Can you tell me how you feel about confetti?
It is not my favorite.
No, that's not just you. That's like literally everybody. It's like confetti.
It's difficult to clean. It's hard to get up, and the only thing worse than confetti is glitter.
I don't want this to be a gendered statement, so I'm going to just say up front that I'm not intending this to be gendered, but my boys currently are not into glitter, and I am not mad about it. There's no glitter in my house, and I am A-okay with that.
It's usually a good 3 or 4 months after a Kesha show before things are really back to normal.
It is funny to be in a venue a day or so after there's been a confetti show, because there will just be like one little stray piece of like shiny confetti like fluttering down.
Yeah, Hey, but it's a real thing, and it's a real expense. So I'll give you the example again of at the Fillmore Auditorium. We will generally charge an extra $1,000 on top of our regular cleaning bill for confetti, and that's not just a revenue center. It's because we have chandeliers, we have we've got all of the stage workings, the lighting, the grid up above us, and we've got to have people come in with an air compressor and blow confetti out in order for things to be safe the next day. A bunch of paper up in the lights isn't a great idea on a stage with a bunch of hot lights. So
I think that that's one of those things that, especially bands that are hitting the level where they're thinking about things like confetti, where it's their first tour, that is a possibility. They want all the things, and they maybe don't understand the costs that come along with it and the challenges that kind of are inherent in it. Are there any other things off the top of your head that you've kind of seen and gone, really, are we doing this? Is this a thing that
one of the other items, and it kind of goes along with confetti to a large degree, that we see on a lot of shows is billing for gases, CO2, propane, things like that, for those kind of gags, for pyro, for cryo, for things like that are happening at a lot of shows. Again, those are things that maybe aren't always budgeted for at initial offer, but usually it's something that we can agree will be a show cost. You do have one other question here on the chat too, Jen.
So Jeff asked if we think that pandemic insurance will become a regular thing. What do you think?
I don't know that it will have to be. I think that there is cancellation insurance that's attached to a lot of larger shows, bigger tours, maybe folks that have some kind of a history of having issues, whether they're health issues or just chronic cancellations. I think those kind of things happen. I don't know that it's necessary to cover us to have something like pandemic insurance, but who knows?
Yeah. So I think we've covered all the things, unless there's any other questions. I had wanted to go back to some spreadsheet stuff, but I actually think that might be better to do. We'll do it a separate thing, so it's very clearly a spreadsheet part 2 workshop, because we've spent about the amount of time that I want to talk today, and I'm glad we got to get through all of this stuff. So if you wanted, let me just check my list. I want to thank you. Thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate being able to see you and get your professional opinion on all the stuff. It was really helpful.
Yeah.
If
Happy to do it.
The attendees out there, do me a special birthday treat and like and follow me on the places and the stuff. It really helps. I do have a little virtual tip jar on jenkellogg.com, which I always forget to mention because I feel awkward about it. But if you have the means, I certainly would appreciate it. And a portion of those tips are going to Crew Nation, which is the Live Nation Roadie Relief Fund. And I also want to just throw another birthday thing out there. If you could go donate blood, I'm doing it. It's an important thing to do. And oh, we do have more questions. Thank you for the happy birthday wishes. Our ticket price is going to go way up due to the fact that venues can't fill their full capacities. Oh, that's actually a pretty good question. I'd like you to answer.
I don't expect that they will, because we also have 30% unemployment right now. So, we've got to make sure that we can bring a product that's that people are going to be able to get to. I think that it is probably going to affect artist guarantees before it affects, in order to keep prices down, more than prices going up. But we and other companies and bands are acutely aware of what the market will bear and what it won't. And we will continue to adjust based on what we can get and what we can pay the artist. So I don't foresee that as a real issue. And as long as we still have most of our participants, Jen, first, I did give blood last month. I'll do it again next month. But thank you everybody for joining here. This is, you know, normally I say, find something else to do. If you're looking at concert industry or the music industry as something to do for a living, honestly, it is potentially super fulfilling. Be prepared to work hard, but if I can give one piece of advice, it is that as soon as we get out of this pandemic, if it's not something that you're already doing, get out there and work in the industry however you can. And that means work security at a small venue, work the bar, work the door, clean toilets, do whatever you have to do to get in there. Because if I'm the guy who's hiring somebody, even on a part-time basis, to come in and work in the office, I'm gonna hire somebody whose face I recognize and who I know from being around the venue and taking interest all the time in whatever way that might be, on the cleaning crew, on the maintenance crew, on the bar staff, what have you. So get out there and definitely just do it. Get whatever gig you can to get your foot in the door. And as much education as you might be getting, having your face in front of people is super, super important.
And to expand on that, that is the best advice. I give people that advice too. Love that advice. I did not plant that in your head. You came up with that on your own. So but also, when your foot is in the door, pick everybody's brain. Everybody loves to talk about their jobs and what they do. And the more that you can ask questions of people to understand what their job is. I had a student once who, she was working guest services at the United Center, and she was like, do you think I should stay here and keep doing this, or should I move back to Virginia or whatever? I was like, have you tried to shadow the marketing person, the box office manager, the event coordinator, the venue rep, like pick you are at a giant arena and you already are employed there. People will give you 20 minutes to answer your questions. And then you've built a connection, you're building a network, you're showing that you're engaged and enthusiastic and you want to learn. And I mean, whenever we're hiring people, we sit around and go, who do we know that we like to that is like engaged and enthusiastic and wants to learn? Yep. So good advice, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you so much. This was awesome.
It's great to see you.
You too.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.